Hey guys, tonight we slip into candlelight and parchment. You're not in your bed anymore. You're sitting cross-legged on a worn wool rug in a long-forgotten records room somewhere beneath the heart of old Istanbul. The air smells like lemon oil and dust. A brass lantern flickers overhead, its glass warped and humming with heat, casting ripples of light over walls lined with scrolls with brittle edges and crimson seals. The floorboards creak, but not unpleasantly, more like an old friend stretching. You're surrounded by whispers, not of ghosts but of numbers, tallies, decrees, tax codes, and poetry. Yes, poetry. Not the kind sung by lovers under balconies or cried out across battlefields. No, these are verses about tariffs and tolls, stanzas carefully inked into the margins of livestock audits, odes tucked inside grain inventories. You're here to meet someone strange. You probably won't survive this if you're allergic to irony, because tonight's story features the most romantic bureaucrat the Ottoman Empire never officially honored. A man who found metaphors in ledgers and haikus in harvest quotas. A man who believed a nation's soul lived between receipts. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You blink, and the room grows warmer. You're in the year 1552. The city is Constantinople, or Istanbul, depending on who's asking. The empire stretches across 3 continents, but you're not in a palace or a battlefield. You're walking into a place most people never think about when they hear the word Ottoman, the records office. Inside, rows of scribes hunched over desks, the air thick with the scent of ink, sweat, and clove tobacco. Each man dips his reed pen into black pools and writes slowly, methodically, as though every digit could change the fate of a village, which it could. And in the back corner, near the window, with the cracked wooden shutter, sits him. You don't know his name yet. Few do. But you recognize him by the way he smiles at paper, like it's telling him secrets. He's small, wiry, with fingers stained black and blue. His robes are simpler than the others. His beard is trimmed, his turban a little crooked. He has the look of someone who just lost sleep over a comma. He's humming. He writes not in silence, but in rhythm. His fingers tapping as if setting meter, his lips forming words he's not quite ready to say aloud. He's copying something, a decree about camel taxes in Edirne. But halfway down the scroll, he pauses. Then he flips it over, and on the back, in the tiny calligraphy of dreams, he begins. O sturdy beast of burden, taxed and tall, you carry empire's gold, and yet know not at all. Yes, that's a poem about camels. And it's actually kind of beautiful. Historians still argue whether his earliest writings were genuine expressions or just a nervous tic. Some claim he suffered from a rare condition called graphomania, a compulsive desire to write. Others think he was mocking the system, poking fun at the pompous language of imperial bureaucracy. And then there's the third theory, that he simply couldn't help but see poetry in everything, even in quarterly reports. His name eventually surfaces, İlyas Efendi, not a high-ranking vizier, not a soldier or spy, just a mid-level clerk from a modest family in Üsküdar, the son of a fisherman and a former silk dyer, raised around accounts, color, and silence. As a boy, İlyas was fascinated by ink, not words, ink, the way it bled through mulberry paper, how different shades smelled different. Walnut ink made him drowsy. Indigo ink made him dream. He once tried to eat a scroll because he believed poetry, if digested, could help him speak more beautifully. It only gave him a week of stomach pain and a deep respect for calligraphy. By 17, he was already copying imperial edicts faster than most trained scribes. But he had a habit, dangerous if adorable. He doodled in the margins, little drawings of cats with turbans or birds wearing medals. Sometimes they spoke in rhymed couplets. Sometimes they just stared judgmentally at the reader. One of his early works survives, barely, a notice about increased wheat tariffs in Bursa. At the bottom, in almost invisible script, he added, "If wheat be taxed beyond its grain, the people's stomachs howl in vain." It was cheeky, it was clever, and it got him whipped. But not fired, because, oddly, the official who reviewed the document laughed. He wrote in the margin next to Ilyas's verse, "This clerk writes with the pen of a jester, but the insight of a vizier." That's when things began to shift. Not in huge, dramatic ways, not with trumpets and proclamations, but with whispers. Whispers that the empire had a poet in its paperwork, a man who could, with the flick of a quill, make sense of chaos. Of course, not everyone was charmed. Some called him dangerous, subversive. Others dismissed him as eccentric, a footnote in the margins of real history. And they were partly right. His life would be almost entirely forgotten, lost in soot and silence, if not for one drawer. One drawer locked in the forgotten wing of an archive. Inside, scrolls, poems, and a single note written in lemon ink. Even bureaucrats have hearts. You sit there, your legs numb, your heart oddly light. You're starting to realize this isn't just about one man. It's about the absurd beauty of noticing. Noticing the poetry in the mundane, the ache behind the arithmetic, the metaphor in a monthly audit. You blow out the lantern, but as your eyes adjust to the dark, you swear you hear something. The soft scratching of a quill, the rhythm of rhyme behind walls. Someone, somewhere, still writing. You wake, or maybe you never really slept, inside the same dusty room. The air tastes a bit more like cinnamon now, and the lanterns flicker lower. Across the chamber, Ilyas Effendi is hunched over his work again, only this time, he isn't copying decrees. He's writing something new, something personal. He's only 23, but his face already carries the gravity of someone who's memorized too many grain prices and burial tax codes. You watch his quill move with care, not haste. Each stroke, each flourish of the letter D is both mechanical and meditative, like he's praying through paperwork. Born in 1529, during one of the quieter years of Suleiman the Magnificent's reign, Ilyas was, as far as records show, the child of compromise. His father, a dockside fishmonger in Üsküdar, dreamed his son might take over the stall and learn the names of all the sea creatures in the Bosphorus. His mother, more pragmatic, envisioned him clerking. Quiet work. Indoors. Less risk of drowning or smelling like mackerel forever. He was too bookish for the former, and too whimsical for the latter. But when he won a scholarship to the Madris, the Imperial Academy for Scribes, his path unfolded like a scroll unrolling on its own. There, he was a brilliant nuisance. He aced arithmetic, but insisted on presenting his results in rhyme. He studied the Kanuname, the Sultan's law book, but annotated it with metaphors about plum trees and bees. One entry reads, "A tax like nectar should neither overwhelm nor disappear. It should sweeten without drowning." Historians still argue whether his instructors were secretly impressed or quietly desperate to pass him along just to stop the literary madness. He graduated near the top of his class, but not because of charisma. If charisma were currency, Ilyas could maybe buy a lentil. He was awkward, fidgety, known for reciting verses to walls and staring too long at patterns in floor tiles. And yet, he got results. Fast, beautiful, accurate results. Which is why, one winter morning, his name appeared on a dispatch from the Sublime Porte. Ilyas Effendi, junior clerk, assigned to the Divan-i Humayun, with access to treasury registers. Now, imagine being 24 and given the keys to the empire's most powerful filing cabinet. The Divan was no ordinary office. It was a swirling engine of policy and pressure, a space where wealth was measured not in coins, but in ink. Tax registrars, legal drafters, and provincial auditors all came to deposit their truths here. And among them, the smallest figure in the room was slowly making the largest impression. On his third day, Ilyas rewrote a receipt for sheep sent from the province of Karaman. The original was dull, even by 16th century standards, but when he handed it back, it included a short couplet at the bottom. From Karaman come 40 sheep. They bleat in scrolls that no one'll keep. He didn't mean it as rebellion. It was a joke, a wink at the system. But it caught the attention of a superior who, rather than punishing him, requested he be assigned to more routine, morale-dampening tasks. Because if someone had to write about manure tariffs, it may as well be someone who could rhyme dung with sung. That year, the empire expanded into Transylvania. Gold flowed in. So did paperwork, and Ilyas thrived. Where others drowned in bureaucracy, he danced. He developed his own system, categorizing reports not just by region or subject, but by emotional tone. These scrolls, he whispered to himself once, are like personalities. Some are proud, some are melancholic, some are just profoundly confused. It was around this time that his colleagues noticed something unusual, the way he muttered to the documents, not reading them aloud, speaking to them, as if the scrolls were shy creatures that needed coaxing. "Who hurt you?" he once whispered to a ledger from Edirne with 7 crossed-out totals and a coffee stain in the corner. Quirky? Absolutely. But he wasn't crazy. Not yet. One of his surviving entries during this period is breathtaking in its absurd beauty. It's a detailed record of soap exports to Damascus, written entirely as a ghazal, the traditional Arabic poetic form used for themes of loss, love, and divine longing. Here's a line. "O scented cube, shaped by fire and oil, you cleanse the hands that ink our toil. Who writes romantic poetry about soap shipments? Ilyas does. And according to one fringe theory, he might have invented the world's first form of bureaucratic performance art. Not everyone was charmed. Some saw him as a distraction. Others, a threat. There were whispers in the halls of the Topkapi Palace that he was frivolous, even dangerous. One bureaucrat, in a memo to the Grand Vizier, wrote, "The poet clerk trivializes the sacred order of registers. He must either conform or be reassigned to latrine audits." Luckily, someone higher up, possibly a bored vizier with a secret taste for sonnets, protected him. Ilyas stayed and kept writing. By 1555, he was already unofficially known as the poet of forms. His fame didn't come from rebellion or satire, but from one simple truth. He cared. About form, about clarity, about turning even the most lifeless document into something readable, sometimes even enjoyable. Historians today can't agree on whether this made him a genius or a lunatic. Perhaps both. One anecdote describes a moment when the Sultan himself briefly glanced at an Ilyas-penned receipt during an audit of Cyprus revenues. Supposedly, the Sultan read the verse at the bottom, chuckled, and said, "This man taxes with charm." Pity. We cannot tax charm itself. Of course, there's no proof of this. The story appears in exactly one account, written a century later by a guy who claimed he found the original receipt inside a broken vase. But it's too good not to believe. And really, would you want a world without that story? You watch Ilyas lift his quill again. He pauses, eyes half closed. The ledger before him lists grain weights, customs fees, and the total number of oxen per village. Yet, as his pen moves, the data begins to blur, then dance, then transform. 2 oxen yoked, their burden shared, like lovers taxed, yet still ensnared. You exhale. This isn't just paperwork, it's poetry. You shift slightly in the candlelight, back still sore from sitting on this imagined Ottoman floor, but your curiosity stretches taller than your spine. You can't look away as Ilyas leans forward, eyes narrowed, tongue pressed slightly to his upper lip, the international sign of someone about to make bureaucracy lyrical. Before him lies a heavy scroll wrapped in olive twine. You recognize it immediately as the infamous Defter-i-Mufassal, a comprehensive register that detailed everything from village populations to tax obligations to the number of looms in each Anatolian province. A census, a ledger, a tome of toil. Most clerks approached it with dread, some faked illness to avoid it. But Ilyas? He cradles it like a newborn, gently brushing flecks of dust off its corner, and then, absurdly, you hear him murmur, "Let's make you sing." Yes, this is the moment when you first witness the birth of his strangest gift, transforming brutal, mathematical data into flowing poetry. Historians later called this era the ledger's lullaby phase. It started innocently. A few rhymed footnotes, then some creative spacing, and soon, entire subsections began to follow poetic meter. There's a record of property values from Konya written as a 12-line poem in the pattern of an Ottoman muwashsha, a poetic form usually reserved for high court praise or mystical longing. It begins, "Upon the fields of Konya's grace, each hut and hearth has earned its place, from orchards bent with apricot to taxes due from each small plot." That's right. He's waxing lyrical about apricot-based property assessments. And somehow, it works. You imagine him pacing, hand behind his back, quoting poetry at the ceiling while trying to decide how to phrase livestock depreciation in a way that doesn't feel like an existential punishment. Others in the office watch with a mix of amusement and alarm. One colleague is said to have quipped, "If he writes one more verse about barley quotas, I'm moving to Cairo." Yet, no one stops him. Because despite his peculiar style, Ilyas's work is, annoyingly, perfect. Every number adds up. Every column aligns. He once corrected a 3-month-old mistake buried in a provincial toll log, claiming it smelled wrong. Smelled wrong? Yes. According to a fringe biographer who wrote about him centuries later, Ilyas claimed he could feel when numbers didn't sit right on the page, like misaligned stars. He'd sniff the parchment, blink a few times, then mutter, "This fee is lying." And somehow, it always was. Historians still argue whether this was pure intuition, a form of number-based synesthesia, or just good old obsessive-compulsive attention to detail. Maybe all three. Either way, his poetic patterns weren't just decoration. They helped him see the truth in tangled data. At the height of this period, he compiled what became known unofficially as the Divan of Duties, a personal collection of over 200 verses, each inspired by a specific tax form, duty list, or shipping manifest. While most of it was later lost, fragments remain. One favorite among scholars is his 22-line ode to the annual sheep tithe. O woolen tide that wanders west through shepherd's crook and merchant's chest, you pay the price in bray and bleat, so Constantinople's lambs may eat. Admit it, you're never going to look at a taxation system the same way again. But not all his works were public. Some were tucked into scrolls that were never meant to be opened by anyone except the Treasury's night shift reviewers. These midnight verses, as some call them now, were more introspective, often melancholic. One fragment, found written along the edge of a shipment inventory for Balkan vinegar, reads, "Numbers sleep, but I remain. A dreamer caught in debt's domain." Some historians interpret this as a crack in the veneer, that behind the charming absurdity, Ilyas was already fraying, that the isolation of poetic bookkeeping, its mix of creative solitude and mind-numbing repetition, was taking a toll. Others think he was just being dramatic. After all, if you're going to suffer, why not make it rhyme? Still, cracks were visible, at least to those who knew where to look. A misfiled register here, an overflourished metaphor about wheelbarrows that probably didn't need to be erotic. His closest friend in the office, a fellow clerk named Halil, known for his stoic handwriting, once warned him, "Too much rhyme, and they'll think you've lost reason." Ilyas replied, "Too much reason, and they'll forget they had hearts." Zing. You quietly applaud. One of the strangest entries during this period was a document about border toll stations near Aleppo. The form itself is standard: dates, amounts, caravan names. But in the margins, he writes a narrative, a mini-story, about two tax inspectors falling in love during an audit. He names them Sevda and Numan. He gives them backstories. They argue about fish tariffs and fall in love over miscounted spice crates. It's absurdly romantic and deeply unnecessary. But there it is, tucked between trade routes and scribbled initials. Historians still argue whether this was a joke, an early proto-novel, or a cry for help from a man slowly drowning in ink and numbers. Some speculate that Sevda was based on a real person, perhaps a courtesan, or a dream he had during a particularly long audit. Others insist she never existed outside of the registry room's candlelight. And then there's the theory that he wasn't writing about someone else at all, but about parts of himself, one side practical, one side poetic, each trying to make peace inside the cramped borders of empire. By now, Ilyas's legend is growing. Students at the madrasa whisper about the verse-smith of tax court. A few even try to emulate his style, with varying success. One poor apprentice was reportedly dismissed after submitting a livestock registry written as a tragic ballad involving star-crossed geese. The empire continues on, oblivious to its unlikely artist. Battles rage, treaties form, maps shift. But in a quiet corner of a stone office in Istanbul, one man continues to alchemize bureaucracy into beauty. You lean back now, realizing the scrolls aren't just records, they're lullabies, not just numbers, but murmurs, the empire breathing through data. And someone, at least once in history, listened closely enough to hear the rhythm in it. You close your eyes. You can almost hear his quill again. Scratch. Pause. Rhymed sigh. Outside, the city hums, a soft, slow rhythm of horses clopping on cobbles, of distant voices drifting over the Golden Horn, of bakers lighting ovens in pre-dawn hush. But you're still inside the archive, or perhaps just inside his mind, because at this point it's hard to tell where Ilias ends and the paper begins. You sit cross-legged again, watching as he opens the door to a room most people fear more than the plague, the registry vault. They call it the room with 40,000 papers, though no one has actually counted them. It's cold, quiet. The walls seem to lean inward under the weight of documents, leather-bound ledgers, cotton paper scrolls, little bundles tied with twine and labeled in a dozen dialects: Arabic, Turkish, Greek, Armenian. Some haven't been opened in a century. You sneeze just looking at them. This is where bureaucracy lives its afterlife. And yet, to Ilias, it's paradise. He enters barefoot, as if stepping into a sacred grove. And maybe it is, to him, a sanctuary of systems, a forest of forms. You follow him down the narrow aisle. He runs his fingers along the shelves, greeting the documents by year, by region, by the feel of the inked binding. You're not sure if he's reading them or listening. Occasionally, he stops, tilts his head, and sighs. "This one still aches," he mutters. "It's a shipment record from 1497. How does he know that?" He selects one scroll, fat, slightly yellowed, sealed with red wax, and brings it to the center desk. As he unrolls it, a brittle whisper escapes the paper, like it's exhaling after a long silence. Inside, the provincial report of Tek, a coastal district where pirates were recently charged double port taxes. Dry stuff. But Ilias reads it like it's opera. He traces every line. He pauses at the note that 14 sheep went unaccounted for, and he smiles sadly, murmuring, 14 ghosts on 4 hooves. You're not sure whether he means the animals or the clerks who missed the error. It's here, surrounded by 40,000 pieces of quiet history, that Ilias begins his most ambitious and maddening project, transforming this entire archive into a single, interwoven poetic cycle. Not just poems about individual taxes or tariffs. No, a narrative. A grand, empire-wide epic told entirely through the overlooked ephemera of governance. Think the Iliad, but with customs declarations instead of swords. He calls it, at least in his private notes, the Quiet Pulse. It begins with a single stanza scribbled into the back of a shipping invoice. The empire breathes not from trumpet's blast, but from each tally, slow and vast. In ink we write what blades forget, the debts, the grain, the lambs unmet. That's right. He's turning tax reports into myth. Historians still argue whether he ever finished the project, or if he even began it outside of his mind. Some believe fragments of the Quiet Pulse are scattered through old registries, encoded as subtle verse. Others think it was merely a fantasy, something he whispered to himself during long nights to keep the silence at bay. But here, in this room, it's real. He has scrolls laid out like battalions. Some are dog-eared with bookmarks, others annotated with abstract symbols, crescent moons, dots, teardrops. He draws lines between entries, stitching connections where none were intended. A shipment of textiles from Rhodes echoes somehow a failed olive harvest in Thessaly. A tariff on nutmeg in Alexandria becomes a metaphor for an unseen love. You're not following all the logic, but somehow you feel the thread pulling through it all. A hidden order in the chaos. He starts muttering character names, some real, some imagined. Mehmet the auditor, struck by divine inspiration during a sugar inventory. Safiye, a merchant's daughter wrongly taxed and turned to ghostly vengeance. Hassan of Trabzon, who finds freedom in misfiled paperwork. He even draws little faces in the margins, giving scrolls personalities. One grumpy-looking scroll, heavy with land taxes from Erzurum, gets a mustache and a speech bubble. Too much snow, too much tax, not enough goats. Yes, it's all deeply unorthodox. And no, he doesn't ask permission. You may wonder why no one stopped him, but you have to understand, this is still the Ottoman bureaucracy. Rigid, yes. Overwhelming, yes. But also glacial. No one checks every drawer. No one reads every scribble. And so long as the numbers add up, most superiors don't care if a clerk wants to doodle, hum, or write an epic poem starring a ledger. Still, not everyone is blind. A new supervisor arrives, Mehmet Pasha, wide-shouldered and famously allergic to joy. He calls Ilyas into his office after reviewing a batch of scrolls, particularly one where Ilyas had replaced numerical summaries with limericks. There once was a scribe from Tarsus, Mehmet reads aloud, whose tax code was known to harass us. He isn't amused. Ilyas, nervous, bows. But instead of apologizing, he offers a different scroll, a standard livestock register, but rewritten, subtly, with poetic flair, balanced perfectly between legal precision and beauty. Mehmet pauses. His nostrils flare. He hates that he can't hate it. He says nothing, just waves Ilyas out. After that, the poet is moved, quietly, suspiciously, to deeper vaults. Less oversight, more dust, perhaps punishment, perhaps sanctuary. There, free from prying eyes, he dives deeper into the quiet pulse. He maps patterns with ink and thread. He creates his own organizational code. He begins assigning scrolls not just by region or year, but by emotion. This stack is longing. That shelf is regret. That cabinet over there? Mild bureaucratic confusion. It's madness, but functional madness. And in time, some of his colleagues start to adopt his poetic shorthand, if not openly, then in secret. Hidden jokes and footnotes, rhymed initials. One scholar claims that by the late 1550s, nearly 4% of imperial documents bore some trace of poetic phrasing, a phenomenon now called the Ilyas drift. You lean your head against the vault's stone wall, drowsy. The air smells of parchment and lemon wax. Outside, muezzins are calling the dawn prayer, but inside, the only sound is the steady scratching of a pen, turning the empire's heartbeat into verse. And in this room of quiet giants, every scroll is listening. The sun is rising now, though you can't see it. You can only feel it through the faint warmth that begins to brush against the upper wall of the archive, the way a sunrise might kiss the ceiling of a forgotten temple. Somewhere, a rooster complains. But you're still in the vault, watching Ilyas hunched over a scroll like a monk contemplating scripture. Only this isn't divine law. It's a list of delinquent property taxes from a village called Kuzilka Hamam, and he's turning it into an elegy. He hums softly, almost musically, and then writes, "In Kuzilka Hamam, where debtors dwell, the olive trees whisper what tongues won't tell. You shift closer. This piece is different, tender, personal. There's something in the curvature of the lines that feels less like satire and more like mourning." Then you see it. At the bottom, under the signature line, a small dedication. For M.E. You think back to the early scrolls, the ones that first caught his superior's attention. Somewhere in one of them, a mundane list of tanners and their production quotas, was an odd little aside. Mehmet never liked the smell of hides. At the time, it seemed like a throwaway, a joke, but now you're seeing a pattern. The initials M.E. appear again, in the margins, in footnotes. Once, scribbled across a duty form like graffiti. He calculated, but he also cared. Ilyas isn't just writing about taxes. He's writing about someone. And not just anyone. A man named Mehmet. A fellow clerk, long retired, possibly dead, or disappeared. The details are sparse, but the references are intimate. He once corrected a scroll with one hand and touched my back with the other. That's one. Another, I remember his voice the way others remember hymns. Historians still argue whether Ilyas and Mehmet were lovers, close friends, or simply two lonely men whose hearts brushed in a world made of ink and silence. The Ottomans were many things, but not fond of open discussions around same-sex affection, especially not among the literate class. So what Ilyas records is coded, whispers in calligraphy. And yet, you feel it, a longing that has outlived the empire itself. One fragment, buried inside a dull shipment record from Sinop, reads, "He is no longer here to dispute my decimals. But still I file, still I fold, still I write, so he may find me again, between the pages." That's not just grief, that's devotion. And so begins what scholars call his elegiac phase. For nearly 5 years, Ilyas writes increasingly ornate entries, almost all of them addressed, indirectly to Mehmet. Some are bitter, some are humorous. One particularly strange piece, hidden in a salt tariff revision, describes how Mehmet once rewrote a fish market fine to spare a widow because she sold stories, not sturgeon. It's romantic, in that crumpled paper, unrequited forever kind of way. The most famous of these, at least among the handful of researchers who still study him, is called The Empty Quill. It's written inside the cover of a livestock registry, and it contains only one line. "All these sheep, and still not one to hold me. You almost laugh, then you almost cry, and then you do neither, because the moment just feels too still, too reverent. You wonder what became of Mehmet. Did he die of plague? Was he reassigned to some border province? Or did he simply fade into the folds of bureaucracy, where names dissolve into numbers and stories are silenced by shelving? Ilyas never tells us, not directly. But his later scrolls include a recurring symbol, a tiny ink blot drawn to resemble a tulip with one petal drooping. You find it dozens of times, always alone, always at the edge of the page, as if he's signing off with a sigh. And this is where the tone of his work begins to shift. Less structured, less musical. He starts leaving verses unfinished. One begins, "The registrar calls. The ink is thin. The ledger yawns but won't begin." And then it just stops. Mid-line. No conclusion. Was he losing interest? Losing hope? Or simply overwhelmed by the reality that no matter how beautiful he made it, bureaucracy would never write him back? Historians still argue whether this was artistic evolution or emotional collapse. One scholar refers to it as melancholy by quill point. Another, more bluntly, a man slowly disintegrating under paper. And yet, it's in this period that Ilyas composes his most astonishing works, not in terms of craft, but in audacity. Take, for example, The Complaint of the Archive, a full-length poem, nearly 60 stanzas, written from the perspective of a forgotten drawer in the tax office. The The drawer speaks about loneliness, neglect, and the smell of mildewed records. It ends with, "I hold the dead by alphabet, and no one dares to dust regret." It's either genius or complete madness, and it catches attention. Rumors swirl through the divan. The poet clerk is losing his grip. One report claims he tried to file a love poem to the Sultan himself, mislabeling it as legal draft, estate wills, and unions. That probably didn't happen, but the fear is growing. No one knows quite what to do with him. He's accurate, he's prolific, he's brilliant, but he's also inconvenient. So they give him a new title, one that sounds important but means very little: Special Keeper of Non-Essential Records. It's a demotion in all but name. A closet office, a rusted inkwell, a window that doesn't open. But you know what he does? He writes. He keeps writing. He begins a new series, Letters to the Lost Accountants, not addressed to any one person, but to all the forgotten clerks of the empire, real or imagined, men who filed, stamped, sealed, and were never remembered. Each poem is written on the back of a discarded form. No structure, no signature. Just, did your ink ever smudge with sweat? Did your numbers ever lie to keep someone warm? Did you ever want to burn the whole archive, just to feel the heat of being noticed? You pause, throat dry. Because, honestly, same. You're still sitting in that office, the closet-sized one with a broken hinge on the door, and the smell of old ink slowly climbing up the walls like ivy. This is where they've stashed him. Not out of cruelty exactly, but the same way someone might put a cracked vase on a high shelf. Still beautiful, just inconvenient. Ilyas doesn't complain, not in words at least. He takes the rusted latch, the dusty scrolls, the leaky roof, and turns them into material. He begins his strangest series yet, verses inspired by the small, infuriating details of daily bureaucratic life, not sweeping metaphors or tragic love notes. Number. These are intimate, oddly reverent meditations on fees, forms, and the finely sharpened misery of office tedium. The first is titled Tariff Number 86, Salt from Varna. It begins, "O salty grain of empire's need, you line our wounds and yet we bleed. A bribe, a scale, a clerk half dead, still stamps the page in smuggler's stead." Yes, that's right. He's romanticizing salt tariffs, and he does it with the gravity of Homer and the dryness of a particularly cursed toast cracker. Then comes a poem about late submission penalties, then one about misfiled fishing licenses, then somehow a 5-stanza piece devoted entirely to the misplacement of a stamp pad. It starts with, "Where's the ink? The red? The black? I'd forge a war to get it back." You chuckle, even as your eyelids grow heavy. It's ridiculous. It's completely unnecessary. And yet, there's a kind of twisted joy in hearing the mundane elevated to the sacred. Historians now refer to this period as the bureaucratic Psalms. There's a small, ever-feuding corner of academia that insists these poems represent the first documented case of administrative surrealism. Others say he was just bored out of his mind. But then, something shifts. You notice it first in the metaphors. A ledge where logic used to sit now bends strangely. A poem about agricultural yield suddenly veers into a vision of a flying file cabinet, weeping over Anatolia. In one haunting passage, he writes, "My pen was once a sword of law. Now it is a feather fallen in ink. I dip, and still no sound, only the flapping of unseen fines. He begins writing at night, exclusively. Office hours become performative. He files, nods, answers when spoken to. But at sundown, he lights a single lantern and lets the hallucinations pour. One clerk swears he saw Ilyas bowing to a scroll. Another, perhaps joking, perhaps not, says Ilyas tried to marry a particularly well-preserved customs declaration. You wouldn't be surprised. This is when the registry hallucinations begin. He claims that some scrolls speak when left alone long enough. Not literally, more like the way dreams speak. One night, he wakes from a nap under his desk and begins feverishly revising a 20-year-old wine tax summary, convinced the numbers were whispered to him wrong the first time. It's hard to know how seriously to take him. Even now, historians argue, was he truly unraveling or performing an elaborate satire on the obsessive rituals of the Ottoman court? Was this his way of resisting the system, or was he simply too deep inside it to find the edge again? One poem from this period offers no answers, only more questions. Scrolls dream in dust, I sleep in margins. My mind is the ledger, pages missing, totals unknown. Still, the empire hums on, grain rises, tribute flows in, armies march, diplomats bow, and no one asks what becomes of the clerk who rhymes about stamp fees. But quietly, slowly, Ilyas's madness or brilliance begins to infect others. A junior clerk named Yusuf starts sneaking verses into shipment reports, just a few rhymed lines here and there. Another clerk starts composing haiku-like reflections inside census summaries. 13 men, 5 goats. 3 of them will not return. 1 will become dust. And one particularly daring assistant replaces an entire inventory form with a sonnet about moldy cheese rations. That one gets him demoted, but still. The seed is growing. Even the chief archivist, old and humorless, is said to have chuckled once at a poetic footnote Ilyas left in a timber transport document. These trees died bravely. May our chairs never forget them. There's no revolution, no decree, no official change. But within the cracks of Ottoman bureaucracy, a strange kind of bloom begins, quiet, ink-scented, and utterly unnecessary. And Ilyas? He watches from his little office, smiling. He knows what he's done. His most famous work from this phase, if you can call anything famous when only 4 people read it, is Pomegranates and Pensions, a series of erotic-leaning metaphors about retirement stipends and seasonal fruit exports. Yes, really. It's deeply weird, deeply beautiful. O pension, ripe and slow to fall, you cling like fruit upon my wall. One bite, and I remember youth, one bruise, and I remember truth. Academics still bicker over whether this poem was actually about the empire's pension system or something else entirely. One paper insists it's about bodily decay and imperial aging. Another argues it's just a complaint about the late delivery of figs. Meanwhile, a very specific Ottoman poetry subreddit insists it's a thinly veiled love letter to a retired lighthouse inspector named Aden. The debate rages on. But through it all, Ilyas continues, tirelessly, obsessively, turning empire into metaphor. And maybe, just maybe, metaphor into empire. You're not sure what keeps him going. The poems don't earn him praise. His superiors remain distant. His colleagues remain wary. His ink supply is rationed. And yet, every night, his pen dips again. Maybe it's not for legacy, not for love, not even for meaning. Maybe he just can't help it. Maybe some people are born to see poetry where others only see paper. And in a world that values exactness, predictability, and record-keeping, that might be the closest thing to rebellion. You feel sleep tugging at your shoulders now, slow and soft. But you stay a little longer, just to hear one more line. He leans in, writes, "Tonight, the forms shall rhyme. Tomorrow, perhaps, the empire." The night deepens, thick as molasses. Even the walls of the registry seem to be dozing now, their shadows stretching longer, softer, like velvet drapes swaying to a breath you can't quite hear. You blink slowly, still in that tiny office with a cracked floor tile and a single feather quill resting in its stand like a sleeping bird. Ilyas is awake, always. By now, the poetic bureaucrat has become legend. Well, legend in the very specific, absurdly niche realm of Ottoman archival gossip. To the empire at large, he's still a nobody, his name filed away under clerks with irregular filing habits. But to a growing group of curious scribes and junior clerks, he is the poet of pensions and pomegranates, the quill-wielding ghost, haunting every dull report with a flash of metaphor. It starts small. A memo about sheep imports gets passed around not for its data, but for the closing verse. They graze, they pay, they grow the state. And still, we salt their fate. Then a financial breakdown of bridge tolls in Anatolia is discovered to contain a cheeky alliteration section. 10 traders took tin through Tokat, taxed twice, tried tears. The rhythm is ridiculous. The rhyme, addictive. And slowly, Ilyas is no longer alone. At the divan's main office, some clerks begin composing little filing haikus as a game. 3 carts of dried figs, 1 cart missing. No one asks. Smells like bribery. It becomes a secret pastime, adding a flourish here, a metaphor there. Hidden footnotes of defiance, of humor, of shared, sacred boredom. Historians still argue whether this counts as early protest literature or just overeducated men going quietly mad in dimly lit offices. But make no mistake, this is cultural seepage, and it all flows from one ink-stained mind, one that now has trouble separating poetry from procedure. You see it most clearly in his dream registers. These begin showing up around 1560, unofficial scrolls written in the style of official forms, but filled entirely with surreal, fictional data. An example: region, the forgotten district of sleep, population, 11,003 size. Revenue, 3 broken wishes, 1 forgiven sin. Primary export, time. These aren't jokes. Not to Ilyas. He files them in dead drawers, behind unused supply cabinets. He tags them with seals borrowed from real decrees. It's a game of ghost paper. Documents that feel real, but slip through fingers like mist. One even sparks confusion during a routine audit, when a bewildered inspector attempts to calculate the trade value of moonlight measured in regret. It doesn't go well. That same inspector, furious, storms into Ilyas's office demanding answers. Ilyas smiles, bows, and replies with nothing but a blank scroll. The inspector, unnerved, backs out. No further punishment follows. Because here's the truth. By now, no one quite knows what to do with him. Too eccentric to promote, too precise to dismiss. He has become the empire's secret conscience, a man who catalogs not just taxes, but feeling. Every tariff a metaphor, every fee a mirror, every scroll a chance to whisper, this mattered, even if no one cared. One clerk describes him as the only man in Istanbul who could make you cry about import duties on saffron. And the people? The public? Well, they don't know his name. But they hear rumors that somewhere in the palace, perhaps in the very heart of it, there is a clerk who can make ledgers sing. And eventually, pieces of his writing leak beyond the archives. A scroll accidentally left in a mosque courtyard. A love poem filed inside a court complaint. A list of import tariffs from Syria slipped into a storyteller's pouch. These fragments drift through the empire like spores, finding strange soil in strange places. A fisherman in Galata quotes a line about unpaid harbor fees as if it were scripture. A caravan master in Diyarbakir paints a verse from a grain register onto the back of his wagon. A retired soldier, missing 3 toes and most of his pension, clutches a line written in spidery calligraphy on a wine-stained receipt. We served, we paid, we filed, and still we are unremembered. No one remembers the scribe, but his words, they travel. And then one day, without warning, a petition arrives. It's unsigned, no wax seal, just a simple folded letter submitted to the Grand Vizier's office. It contains no threats, no demands, only one sentence. Let the poet of the papers be heard. Historians still argue over its origin. Some claim it was sent by a group of scholars from Edirne. Others say it was the palace's janitors, sick of finding scrolls under their feet and wanting the man either rewarded or removed. Still others suggest it was Ilyas himself, submitting his final metaphor. Regardless, nothing comes of it officially. But within weeks, a curious order is issued. All registry forms are to include a designated space for remarks, observations, and notable phrasing. No one says it's for poetry, but Ilyas knows, and he doesn't gloat. He just nods, as if the empire has finally admitted that even in its most rigid corners, something human lingers. He begins his next project, an absurd, overreaching, wildly ambitious anthology he titles The Archive of Us. It's part memoir, part confession, part dream diary. It's written on the backs of disused ration scrolls and misprinted marriage records. He hides it across dozens of storage boxes, using codes only he understands. Each section is titled like a government report. Chapter 6, Irregularities in the Distribution of Hope, 1557 to 1562. Chapter 9, Seasonal Emotions in Villages with No Post Office. And interlaced between the documents are short verses like this. You don't need a war to vanish. You just need to file reports until no one says your name anymore. You feel a chill, but it's not fear. It's recognition. Because maybe you've been there too. Maybe not in Ottoman Istanbul, with ink on your sleeves and paper cuts that sting like betrayal, but in some small cubicle or inbox or errand list, wondering if the things you do ever mean anything. Ilyas thinks they do, or at least they can, if you write them with care, if you speak softly to the paper, if you let your words hold weight, even when no one's listening. You lean against the wall now, heart heavy but full. There's no applause in the archive, no curtain call, only the sound of parchment shifting, like breath, and the faint echo of a clerk, half forgotten, half myth, who dared to make his paperwork feel. You open your eyes to find that time has slinked sideways. Hours or decades might have passed. The air in the archive has thickened, like sleep clinging to silk curtains. But you're still here, still in that crumbling corner room where Ilyas Effendi scribbles, sighs, and occasionally argues with a revenue sheet. Tonight, he's not alone. The scrolls are beginning to whisper, not in words. That would be too easy, but in rustles, in the way the corners lift without wind, in the way a string unravels itself with the shy rhythm of a sentence trying to be heard. Ilyas pauses mid-quill. He tilts his head and whispers, "I hear you." He's been alone in this room for years, too long, sleep-deprived, ink-stained. His mind, always dancing near the edge, now seems to leap. He stands, suddenly, and addresses a stack of ledgers like a professor addressing a stubborn student. "You," he says to a registry of grain tariffs from Kayseri, "are lying about the harvest." Then he turns to a wine import form from Rhodes. "And you, don't smirk at me. You know what you did in 1548. This is the moment, if it hadn't happened earlier, when even the most forgiving historian might admit, Ilyas has unraveled, fully, elegantly, completely. But oh, what a beautiful unraveling. That night, he writes an entire suite of poems called Ink-Stained Dreams. Each one is addressed not to people, but to documents. Some are apologies, some are accusations, some are wistful love letters to files he lost years ago. One is titled "To the Missed Decimal" in the Aleppo Revenue Scroll, and it begins, "You were small, but you ruined me. They blamed me, but it was you, a speck of ink, a breath I held too long." It's either heartbreak or high-stakes accounting. Another is written entirely in second person, yes, like this narration, and it's addressed to a burned file that may or may not have contained a marriage registry from Erzincan. "You held their names, now you hold only smoke. I tried to remember them for you, but I am only one pen." The scrolls pile higher. The nights grow longer. The poet writes faster. Ink bottles vanish faster than coffee. He stops dating his entries, stops eating on time. Rumors say he began wearing the same robe every day, embroidered with lines of his own verse. His supervisor tries to intervene, gently suggesting he take a short leave. Ilyas replies, "Leave from what? I live where the empire keeps its memory." There's not much to say to that. Around this time, reports begin to surface of unusual behavior among other clerks. Night scribes staying after hours, murmuring to cabinets. One is caught composing a sonnet to a census form. Another carves a rhymed couplet into the desk. It's spreading. Whether it's madness or inspiration, no one can tell. But even the janitors feel it. They say the air in the registry room feels thicker now, the shadows longer, the scrolls heavier than their weight. One night, Watchman swears he saw the seal of a 1543 wheat quota pulse faintly in the dark. Some say the building is haunted. Others say it's just Ilyas's aura, bleeding through the ink. And then something strange happens. Ilyas stops writing. Not completely, but gradually. The pages thin, the margins grow wider, the metaphors more sparse. Instead of rich poetic stanzas, he begins leaving single lines, sentences that feel more like weather than thoughts. One scroll reads, "The numbers are fine, but no one reads them like I do." Another, inside a shipment report from Thessaloniki, simply says, "I'm still here." It's around this time that his closest confidant, a young scribe named Layla, one of the few women in the archives, visits him after hours. She finds him sitting on the floor, barefoot, surrounded by unrolled scrolls in a perfect circle. She asks what he's doing. He says, listening. To what? To the weight of forgotten things. Layla, a rational person with very little patience for nonsense, still never forgets that moment. Years later, she tells her students that it was the first time she realized history wasn't just about events, it was about echo. She begins archiving his strange writings in secret, hiding them, saving them. She titles the collection Whispers from the Quill. It's thanks to her that anything survives. Because the empire, like most empires, isn't built to remember those who listen too long to silence. One day, without warning, Ilyas's desk is cleared. No one knows who orders it. One rumor says the chief archivist demanded it after finding a haiku written on the back of an audit summary. Another says someone higher up grew tired of his atmospheric interference. All we know is that one morning, Layla arrives to find his desk empty. His ink bottle is dry. His chair slightly askew. His robe folded neatly on the shelf with one final note tucked inside. If you need me, read what's left behind. Historians still argue what happened next. Some claim he retired quietly to a coastal village and died writing sea breeze poems about fishing quotas. Others insist he was quietly exiled, sent to audit provincial waste records until he forgot his own name. But the most persistent legend? That he disappeared into the archive itself. Not metaphorically, literally. That somewhere, deep in a locked cabinet, behind mislabeled census maps and forgotten invoices, there's a scroll that, when opened, contains his final poem, and not written on it, but as it. A poem shaped like a registry. A registry shaped like a man. And sometimes, on the quietest nights, new clerks claim they feel a hand guide theirs as they write. A gentle correction, a whisper, a rhythm. They call it the archive's breath. And they say it rhymes. You blink, unsure whether you've been asleep or simply thinking too slowly. Everything is hushed. Not the quiet of absence, but of reverence. Like the walls themselves are trying to hold their breath. The lamp above Ilyas's old desk flickers once, then glows steady, as if remembering. And here's the strange thing. Even after his disappearance, whatever that word means when referring to someone who may have merged with metaphors, the empire doesn't forget him. At least, not entirely. Because while official records stay sterile, something odd begins to bloom in the bureaucratic underground. Anonymously, subtly, new scrolls begin to circulate. No author, no insignia, just verses attached to dry reports. Some etched into the edges of land registries, others scribbled onto the back of naval rosters. Always unclaimed, always unsigned. One poem appears inside a grain tax report from Gallipoli. A ship arrives, its hull is full, but still the paper feels too dull. So let me spice the cargo here with stanzas salted into fear. Clerks whisper about them. They call the author the rhyming madman of the tax court. Half admiration, half mockery, all mystery. Historians still argue whether this was Ilyas himself, having snuck back into the archive as a ghost, or perhaps something more mundane, disciples continuing his craft, imitators, secret fans. And here's where it gets complicated. Some documents suggest the Sultan himself, yes, the Sultan, came across one of these strange annotated ledgers. possibly a tax receipt wrapped around a wine barrel invoice. The verse, deliciously vague. You may own the vineyards, but the grapes belong to silence. It said the Sultan laughed, or frowned, or simply stared for a long while, then folded the paper in half and handed it to his advisor without a word. We'll never know. But shortly after, a new directive was quietly issued across select bureaus of the empire. All clerical training shall include lessons in calligraphy, rhyme structure, and metaphor awareness. No explanation, no attribution, just an imperial decree that somehow treated poetic rhythm as a required clerical skill. Naturally, this sparks debates. Some officials see it as harmless flair, a way to beautify the empire's handwriting. Others consider it heresy. One furious treasurer writes in a margin, "Poetry is not a policy," and is promptly ignored. But the decree sticks. Over the next few years, the empire's paperwork becomes different. Not all of it, not the wars or the executions, but the inventories, the tax codes, the regional memos, they begin to shimmer. 3 carts of oil, 1 broken axle, 1 curse. Still counted as paid. That's from an Anatolian olive oil shipment log, now housed in a private collection. The signature is missing, but the style is unmistakable. Academics try to categorize the phenomenon. They debate whether it's literary rebellion, creative bookkeeping, or bureaucratic satire gone viral. They give it names like the form Renaissance and the scroll flourish movement. One particularly overzealous scholar insists it marks the beginning of postmodernism, despite being 400 years early. And beneath all that noise, the quiet hum of something stranger. You see, strange reports begin to emerge. Clerks in isolated offices, places where the lamps flicker more than they should, start claiming the scrolls, respond. Not always, and never clearly. But sometimes, late at night, they hear a whisper. Sometimes they write a verse in the margin, and the ink dries faster than usual, almost as if pleased. Sometimes they leave a draft unfinished and return to find the final line completed in handwriting not their own. Most ignore it, but a few believe. They call it the ink echo. They say it's Ilias, still present somewhere inside the fibers of the paper or the patterns of the script. A ghost, not of flesh, but of attention. A ghost who simply cares about the beauty of forms. Of course, not everyone is enchanted. One famously humorless treasurer in Damascus tries to ban all poetic annotations in 1571. Declares that verses distract from the imperial goal of maximum extraction with minimum sentiment. His name? Lost to history. But a month after his decree, his own tax ledger shows up with this line scratched into the inside flap. He taxed the soul until it fled, and still could not explain his dread. Poetic revenge, the best kind. By now, you're seeing it too, aren't you? How absurdity becomes memory. How a single man, unthanked, underpaid, slightly unhinged, left ripples in an ocean made of paper. How even an empire, sprawling and ancient, can feel the gentle nudge of one clerk's refusal to be dull. Because Ilias wasn't trying to change the system. He was trying to feel it, and to help others feel it too. That's why his legacy lingers not in statues or battle songs, but in scrolls, forgotten ones, misfiled, misplaced, half-burnt, but still carrying echoes. You think of that note he left behind, If you need me, read what's left behind. It wasn't a farewell. It was a map. And somewhere, you suspect, a young apprentice in some far-flung registry office is reading a livestock report and pausing to smile at a single, lovely line. The goat was loud, the numbers wrong, but both still made a kind of song. And maybe she adds a line of her own, and maybe the echo answers. By now, the idea of reality feels a bit loose around the edges. You're not entirely sure if you're still dreaming or simply thinking too deeply into a warm cup of sleep. Either way, you're still inside the archive, or what's left of it. The walls seem further apart tonight, the shelves heavier with stories. Somewhere, a draft curls around your ankles like a sleepy cat. The past is settling in beside you. And suddenly, everything changes. There's a commotion in the archives. Not a revolt, exactly, but something close. It begins with a single scroll. An internal memo from the province of Aden goes missing. No one panics. Scrolls disappear all the time, misfiled, misread, chewed by goats. But this one contains a key calculation: the grain tax rate for an entire region. And instead of the expected rate, 2.3%, the scribe, either sleep-deprived or cursed by the decimal gods, had written 23%. That's a difference large enough to starve a village. For weeks, officials in Aden demand an explanation. Farmers riot. A local imam writes a letter to the palace saying that God himself wouldn't survive under these fees. Traders blockade the district's main road, burning effigies of number men. For weeks, officials in Aden demand an explanation. Farmers riot. A local imam writes a letter to the palace saying that God himself wouldn't survive under these fees. Traders blockade the district's main road, burning effigies of number men. It's called the Paperwork Revolt of 1565, small in scale, but big in embarrassment. And at the center of the storm? The scroll in question had passed through only one man's hands, Ilyas Effendi. He is summoned, dragged from whatever dusty corner he's currently haunting. A tribunal is assembled. The scroll is unrolled, and the damning line is read aloud. The chamber is silent, except for the faint hiss of someone trying not to laugh. Because after the mistaken 23% tax line comes a 4-line poem. They count the grain and miss the grief. They tally lives like autumn leaf. A decimal is small, you say. But what you tax, you take away. Gasps. A muffled choke from a junior scribe. Even the grand clerk raises an eyebrow. There are no formal charges. Not yet. But make no mistake, this could be it for him. One more poem, and he's gone. So what does Ilyas do? He writes another poem. Not a defense, not an apology, a play, a tragic comedy, to be precise. A staged reading, performed only once, by him alone in the dim light of the registry, 3 nights before his tribunal. He calls it Scrolls and Scandals, a comedy of clerical errors. It features a bumbling accountant, a tax form with low self-esteem, and a poetic ghost who lives inside a cabinet. At one point, the ghost whispers to the form, "You are more than numbers. You are breath between transactions. You are the pause between signatures." It's absurd, brilliant, moving. Layla finds the script and presents it, uninvited at the hearing. She reads it aloud, slowly, carefully, and when she finishes, no one claps, but no one speaks either. Eventually, someone coughs. The Grand Clerk says, "Well, that was unexpected." Another official murmurs, "At least it's scanned properly." And in that moment, everything changes. Because no one wants to be the one to exile the poet. Not when he's just made the empire feel something about a decimal. The official punishment? Nothing. The unofficial one? He's transferred to a quieter post. Fewer ledgers, fewer eyes. He is given charge of something no one else wants. The misfiled scrolls division. Which, of course, is perfect, because that's where he finds them. Lost scrolls, discarded reports, documents written by scribes long dead, some of them incomplete, some of them wrong, some of them eerily beautiful in their imperfection. He begins cataloging them, but not in the traditional way. He doesn't just label them, he speaks to them. You were misplaced, but not useless. You weren't wrong, just early. He builds an entire system of reference based on tone. He files scrolls under categories like regretful, eager but confused, overcompensating for missing data, and hopeful despite everything. It's madness, but brilliant madness. And one day, a scholar from Cairo visits. She is sent to research trade discrepancies between two provinces. She expects resistance. Instead, Ilyas hands her a bundle of scrolls labeled, "Truths Told Twice and Once Believed." She doesn't know what that means, but inside, she finds exactly what she needs. And on the back of one scroll, a small verse. You came for numbers. You'll leave with meaning. Both are true. One is heavier. Word spreads, quietly, like mist curling through cracks. Soon, clerks begin submitting intentionally misfiled scrolls just to see what label Ilyas gives them. One sends a blank sheet. Ilyas returns it stamped, potential. Another sends a page filled with errors. Ilyas writes on the margin, still learning. Let it pass. He becomes a secret oracle. A bureaucratic whisperer. But not everyone is amused. A report is filed. An official inquiry is launched. One auditor writes, "This man files feelings instead of facts." The response? Feelings are facts. They just take longer to process. No one can argue with that. Because by now, no one wants to. Even the highest officials, those with the stiffest collars and the sharpest pens, find themselves pausing before discarding a document. Would Ilyas forgive this? They wonder. You sit there, watching the dust float through the air like lazy punctuation, and realize something shocking. He's won. Not loudly, not officially, but fully. His madness has become method, his rhythm, policy, his poetry a quiet rule of its own. And in a room where a decimal once sparked a riot, a man now files grief and hope under the same tab, things that mattered. You shift your weight, the wooden floor cool beneath you, the air in the archive as thick as velvet. Lanterns gutter low, casting long shadows over the parchment towers that surround you. It's quiet now, not the eerie quiet of absence, but the soft, full silence of something that has finished becoming itself. You watch Ilyas, older now, the lines on his face deeper, his fingers slower, but no less precise. He sits at a small desk made from 2 crates and a plank. Around him, scrolls that have no titles, no stamps, no seals. These aren't assignments. They're offerings. By now, scribes from across the empire send him scrolls wrapped in curiosity, Memos they don't understand, ledgers that feel off. Sometimes they include a note. I think this one is sad. Can you confirm? And he does. Not with red ink or angry margin marks, but with poetry. He doesn't correct errors. He speaks to them. A land registry from a drought-struck village comes to him incomplete. He adds, "The fields forgot their own names, but the dust remembered them, softly." A census report listing 6 children in a household gets a quiet footnote. The 7th didn't make it to paper, but she danced in the ink. You feel something strange bloom behind your ribs, because this isn't just storytelling, it's healing. Historians call this his compassionate period, though Ilyas himself never names it. He's long past caring about reputation or legacy. He just listens, writes, files, as if the act of archiving sadness gives it somewhere to rest. Around this time, he begins composing a new scroll, one that's different, not tied to any form or law, a personal project he hides behind a false wall in his cabinet. He titles it Verses on Silk, Sent to Nowhere. Each entry is written on the back of imperial silk inventory reports, scraps of decadence, of trade, and taste. But the words aren't about fabric, they're about absence. Each poem is addressed to someone he's never met, a different stranger in each one. Sometimes a name is imagined, Yasmin, Idris, Anna. Other times it's simply, to the one who waits but does not know what for. The poems are intimate, aching, and entirely unsolicited. One reads, "If no one ever told you your breath was enough, this scroll does. Breathe again." Another, "You are not forgotten, only unarchived," which is not the same. It's as if he's sending poetry out into the darkness, hoping it finds a face, like letters to the future, or to the lost. He hides these scrolls in unexpected places, slipped inside routine tax reports, folded between agricultural maps, tucked behind cabinet drawers with deliberate care. A few are even tied to pigeons and released into the sky, their destinations unknowable. Scholars still debate whether any of these scrolls were ever found. But one thing is clear, Ilyas isn't writing for approval anymore, or policy, or fame. He's writing for witness. Even if that witness never arrives, even if the only one listening is the scroll itself, his handwriting changes, less ornamental, more honest. His lines are no longer symmetrical, no longer obsessed with elegance. They breathe, lean, stumble, like people trying to say hard things. One entry reads, "You will not know me. But if this reaches you, and you feel even a little less alone, then it was worth the ink." You pause, because that line, it's not for a clerk, not for a sultan, not even for a memory. It's for you. That's when you realize you're not just a listener. You're not just a late-night dreamer following ink trails through dusty drawers. You're the stranger he wrote for. You're the face he never met. And somewhere, in this tangled empire of scrolls, one was always meant for you. Even if it never arrived, even if it sat unread for centuries. It existed, and that, to Ilyas, was enough. Meanwhile, in the wider empire, his quiet rebellion continues. More scrolls arrive every week, some with verses already on them, some blank but clearly hoping. A network forms, unofficial, invisible, but undeniable. They call themselves the Whisper Quill. Archivists, scribes, dreamers. each one carrying on the tradition of finding humanity in numbers, emotion in forms, story in statistics. They don't meet, they don't publish, but they leave signs. A tulip drawn beside a date, a line of rhyme hidden between rice export tallies, an intentional smudge in the shape of a crescent moon. When questioned, they deny everything. Just a smudge, they say. Just a pretty signature. But those who know, know. And what of Ilyas? He fades, quietly, without obituary. One day, his desk is found empty, his scrolls still organized, his final poem resting atop a shipment form for dried figs. This ledger ends, but the pulse continues. Count me among the numbers, or don't. I'll be in the silence between them. No body, no tomb. Only paper. And that's the way he wanted it. Because he knew that monuments crumble. But margins last forever. Especially when they're written with care. Especially when they rhyme. The room is quieter than ever now. You're not sure if the silence is from reverence or simply the stillness of something complete. Like a held breath just after the last note of a song. The lantern above flickers gently, but offers no drama, just warmth. You feel the echo of a voice that isn't speaking anymore, and yet it lingers. After Ilyas's disappearance, the registry carries on. The empire moves forward, as empires do. Campaigns are launched, treaties signed, provinces reorganized. There are new viziers, new borders, new taxes. But somewhere inside that labyrinth of records and ratios, the feeling changes. It starts with small acts. A junior clerk in Damascus begins filing supply records with tiny illustrations in the margins. Grapes, goats, stars. When asked why, he shrugs and says, they feel lonely without them. A tax report from Bosnia contains a quote, count them fairly, then let them go. In Aleppo, a registry of road tolls is submitted entirely in blank verse. No one is punished. Instead, someone files them away. Carefully. And then, across the empire, an odd pattern begins to appear in the misfiled scrolls division. Scrolls arrive with no clear origin, and stranger still, many of them are beautifully written. Metaphor rich, rhythmically sound, emotionally honest. They are unsigned, always, but always, unmistakably familiar. One scroll describes a caravan's inventory of glass and wool, but ends with a chilling stanza. The glass remembers hands it never met. The wool forgets the sheep. But someone, somewhere, still wears both, and doesn't ask how they arrived. Scholars call these the silent codex, a growing body of orphaned scrolls that bear the poetic fingerprints of someone or some network who refuses to let administration be heartless. Some speculate these are lost works of Ilyas, found and recopied. Others believe a circle of anonymous poets took up his mantle. Still others whisper that he never disappeared at all, that he simply learned how to write without a name. You consider the possibility. Not that he faked his death, not exactly, but that he allowed himself to vanish so the work could speak louder. And it does speak. In 1573, a high-level audit of the Ottoman naval budget discovers a curious line embedded in the expenditure table. If ships are counted but not kissed by wind, then the sails are only paper. The auditor laughs. He sends it to the Grand Vizier. It circulates among the court. By the end of the month, someone writes back anonymously, "Even sails made of paper can dream." Meanwhile, the archivists, the true keepers of this secret heritage, begin compiling what they call the Lost Codex of Dusty Humor, a hidden anthology of poetic anomalies found in ledgers, manifests, and registries from across the empire, each one a fingerprint of humanity smuggled through ink. You're lucky because you get to read some of it. One entry, a poem praising the efficiency of land tax assessments in the Konya region. It starts sensibly, almost academically, until the final lines. The soil paid on time. The people paid in silence. But still, the tulips bloomed. Another, written on the inside flap of a customs declaration for walnut exports. Some walnuts never crack. They stay whole, unopened. They are the lucky ones? And another, written on parchment so faded you have to squint to see it. We do not keep these records for the state. We keep them for the ones who lived between lines, and sometimes for ourselves. Historians naturally remain skeptical. Some dismiss the entire codex as a myth, fabricated by romantics nostalgic for a bureaucracy that never truly felt. Others insist there's coded meaning in the location of each scroll, that if you read them in a certain order, they reveal a hidden map of emotion across empire, that Ilias wasn't just a poet, he was an archivist of the soul. The more grounded scholars roll their eyes, but then there's that one recovered scroll from 1580. A tariff report mislabeled and tucked deep in the palace records. It contains only one phrase, written diagonally across the margin. Let me file my grief somewhere. No one knows who wrote it, but the handwriting, it's familiar. And there, suddenly, you understand something vital. Ilias was never trying to be remembered. He was trying to remember others, the invisible workers, the forgotten names, the errors that were not mistakes, but merely misunderstood moments. And you, sitting there now, leaning against the quiet hum of history, you realize you've become part of the archive, not in the literal sense, not yet, but in the quiet understanding that someone saw something in the small things and turned it into something beautiful. Not in battle, not in glory, but in rhythm. You reach toward one of the scrolls near your side and gently open it. The paper creaks like an old man stretching. It's a registry of bridge tolls. Nothing dramatic, just columns of numbers and names. Except, at the bottom, each step across that bridge, they carried more than goods. They carried hopes, fears, letters, bread, and the faint idea that someone might notice. You smile. Someone did. Someone always did. The lamp has burned low, and yet it doesn't flicker like it used to. It glows with the soft steadiness of something that knows its job isn't done. You're deep in the vault now, far past the official shelves, past even the misfiled cabinets, in a place that may not exist on any map. The only index here is intuition. You're not sure how you got here. You followed a story, maybe, or a whisper, or perhaps just the rhyme. Before you is a scroll, unlabeled, unsealed. It doesn't look special. The parchment is dull, the edges frayed, but something about it draws you, like it's been waiting. You unroll it slowly. There is no title, only a single phrase at the top. Death by quill or melancholy. You pause. The scroll unfolds further, revealing a series of uneven verses. They don't follow any formal pattern. They're fractured, hesitant, like breaths taken too late. This is different. This isn't playful, not even poetic in the usual way. It's raw, unfiltered, and it begins. The ink runs. So do I. But where to file fear? It's the handwriting, Ilias's, but faded, slanted, almost like he didn't want to finish the letters, like he was letting them fall out of his hand instead of crafting them. This is near the end. You read further. The forms are still here. The empire still breathes. But I am inkless. That's not metaphor. That's exhaustion. Another line. They ask for totals. I offer truths. They stamp it anyway. You sit back, because it's not just the content. It's the absence in the scroll that startles you. Huge sections are blank, not skipped, just left, waiting. There's no signature, no flourish. The last line reads, "If you find this, file it where the sorrow goes." And then, nothing. Not even a period. Historians still argue whether this was his final piece, the last work of Ilyas Effendi. Some insist it was a forgery, a melancholy apprentice's attempt at homage. Others are certain it was his, found in a locked drawer of the misfiled scrolls room, only opened decades later during a fire evacuation. There's no definitive answer. And that feels right, because Ilyas's life, like his poetry, resisted neat conclusions. But there is one odd detail. In the same drawer where this scroll was found, there was another, a blank one, completely untouched, save for 3 words written in the center. Still not done. You imagine it now. A man, hunched over a desk, bones aching, eyes watery, writing one final truth, and then stopping. Not out of fear, not even fatigue, but because he'd already said what needed saying, and everything after would just be repetition. He didn't need a dramatic farewell. No suicide note, no final epic. Just the quiet surrender of a man who had spent his life putting feeling into places where no one thought to look. A ledger, a tax form, a blank space. Death by quill? Possibly. Melancholy? Certainly. But what's certain is this. He left a trail, not of declarations, but of echoes. And the people who found his work, whether days later or centuries, were never quite the same. One young scribe reportedly wept upon reading his final, incomplete poem. Said she, felt like she'd stumbled upon someone else's thoughts mid-exhale. Another clerk from Anatolia claimed he found a scroll with a simple note. File your love, even if it's not official. The empire never mourned him formally. No holiday, no tomb, no statue. But in an obscure corner of the Istanbul archives, a shelf bears an odd placard. It simply reads, "Here lies what couldn't be categorized." Inside, unlabeled scrolls, half-written poems, tax records with verses scribbled in the corners, fragments of thoughts dressed as data. And near the bottom, one crumpled note that reads, "He filed his name under silence, but the margins remembered." You close your eyes. You wonder what it means to leave behind nothing official, but everything essential. You wonder how many people do their work in obscurity, trying not to be noticed, and yet change everything. And then you remember. You're still in that chair, still holding that final scroll, still breathing. The ink has dried, but the meaning hasn't. It pulses quietly through your fingers, waiting. By now, the scroll in your lap feels warmer than it should. Not like it's hot to the touch, but like it remembers hands, his hands, and the quiet pulse of years that passed through every stroke of the quill. You sit back, letting your eyes rest on the shelves that surround you, shelves no longer silent. Because after his passing, if you can even call it that, something peculiar begins to happen in the heart of the archive. The registry room, the one Ilyas once inhabited, starts behaving differently. Clerks who work late report strange dreams, not nightmares, not visions, but memories that aren't theirs. One assistant says she dreamt of tallying sheep in a faraway village, even though she's never left Istanbul. Another wakes crying, unable to explain why, except that she'd lost a decimal that had once been a friend. They laugh it off, blame ink fumes, dust, paper mites. But the stories continue. One clerk swears he heard humming behind a cabinet, only to find nothing there except an old scroll with a line penciled faintly in the corner. Even ghosts need filing. Another finds his pen moving on its own, not writing, exactly, but nudging, correcting a curve in the calligraphy that had been ever so slightly off. He doesn't tell anyone. Not right away. And then there's the matter of the humming. Low, software wordless, but persistent, only at night, only in that room. A sound like someone gently reading to themselves, or perhaps singing, never loud, never startling, but always present. Some call it the registry's echo. Some say it's the building settling. Others aren't so sure. One archivist, older than most scrolls in the room, begins collecting these stories. She assembles them into a book, an internal document never meant for publication. It's titled, The Echoes in the Registry Room, half observation, half confession. In one chapter, she writes, "We do not shelve the past, we breathe it, and sometimes it breathes back." The book is quietly passed among clerks, whispered over tea, not because it's forbidden, but because it's sacred, like a prayer wrapped in twine. And then there's the matter of the quill. Yes, his quill. It had vanished after his departure, believed lost, burned, or buried with papers. Until one day, a janitor opens a drawer and finds it resting atop a blank scroll. It shouldn't be there. The drawer had been locked. The janitor hadn't opened it, but there it is. The quill is simple, wood worn smooth, the nib dull but intact. Beside it, a tiny folded slip of paper, unsealed. 3 words, "Begin again," gently. No one claims it, but no one moves it either. Instead, a quiet tradition begins. New scribes, on their first day, are brought to that drawer. The scroll is fresh. The quill remains. They're told, write something, anything, but mean it. Some write names, some write questions. Some leave the scroll blank, whispering their words instead. The drawer is always closed with care, and somehow, every time it's opened again, the scroll is blank once more. No one questions it, because some things aren't meant to be explained, only repeated. You begin to understand now that the story of Ilyas wasn't about rebellion or even poetry. It was about presence, a presence that refused to be categorized, stamped, or retired. a presence that lives in the rhythm between figures, in the sigh of a rolled parchment. In the second, someone pauses before signing their name. It lives in the fact that even today, centuries later, there are clerks, scholars, and silent dreamers who still check the margins for verses. Not because they expect to find one, but because they might. And because knowing someone once hid poetry in paperwork reminds them that everything, yes, everything, has the potential to be art. That even bureaucracy can have a heartbeat. You look again to the shelves. They seem to shimmer now, not with dust, but with memory. You notice the uneven labels. The scrolls filed not just by province, but by feeling. Slight regret, 1456. Hopeful confusion, 1492 to 1501. Unjust but beautiful, unknown origin. You wonder if he really did this, or if those who came after him learned to. Maybe that's the point. Maybe legacy isn't about what you leave behind. Maybe it's about how others choose to keep going. And they do. Because somewhere, someone is still writing scrolls. Still humming. Still pausing before the final line. You rest your head against the back wall of the registry, breathing slowly now. You imagine the man with the crooked turban and ink-stained sleeves. You imagine his fingers moving with care, his voice reciting to silence, his pen dancing even when no one's watching. And then you realize, even if no one writes another verse, the rhythm? Still here, still waiting, still breathing. It's late now, later than late. The kind of hour where even the shadows begin to yawn. You sit with your back against the last shelf, your hands folded over a scroll that no longer needs reading. Not because it's empty, but because you already know what it would say. It's all been said. But you stay anyway, because something's happening in the quiet. The registry room, its old stones and sighing shelves, isn't just a place anymore. It's a rhythm, a presence. You can feel it under your fingertips. Not heavy or haunting, just familiar. Maybe that's how it happens. How stories become soil, how names dissolve but meaning lingers, like warmth in a coat long since folded, like a smell you can't describe, but recognize down to the bone. And somewhere in that slow quiet, a realization lands gently, like a letter slid under a door. This was never about one man. Not really. It started with Ilyas, yes, the clerk who wrote verses about tax forms, who whispered tenderness into the dry arithmetic of empire. But the story, the real story, was never bound by his name. It was about what he made possible, the pause, the metaphor, the feeling that even the most forgettable task could still hum with meaning. Even in a world ruled by numbers, there was space for care. And now, that rhythm lives on. In places it shouldn't. A corner of a customs form in Beirut, a shipping log in Alexandria, with a note that simply says, "Be kind." This caravan was tired. A forgotten drawer in Skopje, where someone found a poem inside an oil inventory. They came for wax. They left with light. No one remembers who wrote them, but everyone recognizes the voice. You wonder if that's what he wanted all along. Not applause, not credit, but continuity. A living legacy written not in marble, but in margins. And maybe that's why, centuries later, archivists still tell the tale. Usually after hours, over tea. in that hush that settles between colleagues who know too much and say too little. They call him different things: the scribe of sighs, the archivist's ghost, the man who filed feeling. But they never speak the name Ilyas Effendi too loudly, because in some circles, names are too sacred to be rattled by careless mouths. Instead, they listen to the way a scroll curls, to the silence between numbers, to the softest humming from the registry room where no one is supposed to be. They listen, and sometimes they answer. With ink, with rhythm, with a whisper back. And tonight, you've heard it too. You don't need to write anything down. Not now. But if, one day, you find yourself reaching for a pen, tapping it softly before the first word, then maybe, just maybe, he's still with you. Not to haunt, but to help you listen. Because some ghosts don't wail. Some just rhyme quietly. Some are content to live forever between the lines. And if you ever forget what that feels like, open any drawer, wait, and listen. The story slows now. The ink has dried. The lamps flicker lower. The shelves, tired from holding centuries of breath, finally exhale. You sit in the stillness, not needing to move, just listening to the soft thrum of quiet paper, the creak of wood gently settling, the whisper of a quill that may or may not still exist. It's peaceful here, not empty, just enough. Enough story to drift you toward sleep, enough rhythm to carry you over the edge of thought. The numbers, the poems, the soft sighs of forgotten scribes, they're all folded now, resting in some drawer beyond reach. And you? You're safe. You've been heard. Whatever you carried into tonight, questions, worries, that list in the back of your head you still haven't written down, let them sit here a while. The registry will keep them. Quietly, carefully. You can pick them back up in the morning. Or not. There's time. Because even now, as your eyes grow heavy and the story begins to dim, one truth remains. What matters will wait, and what's meant for you will find its way back. Perhaps in a margin, perhaps in a dream, or maybe in the gentle echo of a line you've already forgotten, but still feel. Sleep now. Let the scrolls rest. Let your breath slow. And if the room hums while you drift, that's just the paper remembering. Good night.